Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and thanks to Valentin and Stefano for putting together this fantastic program in an amazing location. So when we think about learning from about the world and about ourselves, we often think about learning from external feedback. So if you were to get a prize, then you may increase your perception that you're doing well at your job, and that might lead you to, for instance, be more willing to get out of bed in the morning and go to work. And as we heard in Florent's talk, this kind of updating from external information has been well studied in psychology and neuroscience, and we now have sophisticated frameworks, theoretical frameworks, for trying to understand that process. But we also have the ability to self-realize that perhaps we've made good or bad decisions, even in the absence of any external feedback. And this is what psychologists refer to as metacognitive evaluation or self-monitoring. And this has mostly been studied in developmental and educational research, where people are interested in how children monitor the state of their own knowledge. But the neural and computational mechanisms are less well understood. And I'm very interested in the notion that we could borrow, build on insights from work done on decision making in the face of external information, and try and kind of import those into the study of metacognition. And this recently has been highlighted by people here in Paris, so Stan Dehen and Sig Kuide and Hak Quan Lau, as perhaps being understanding how metacognitive works at a more algorithmic level may help us understand how consciousness may be implemented down at the level of mechanisms. So how should we think about metacognitive computation? So I want to start with a really simple example. So imagine that I put you in an experiment where I ask you to decide whether a stimulus is tilted to the left or to the right. I could flash it very briefly, make that quite difficult for you. And the task here is to try and make an accurate decision about the state of the world. And so most models of this kind of decision would suggest that you get some kind of internal noisy impression of that world state, and then based on that noisy impression you make some kind of action, a response to the experimenters to say yes, the stimulus was to the left or to the right. Now, if you're in a situation where you're being told whether you're right or wrong, then you effectively get information about the true state of the world, and then you could use that together with the action that you made to know whether you made a right or wrong decision. Whereas if you don't get feedback, the common idea about how you might model a sense of whether you were right or wrong in this kind of setting is the idea that the subject is able to estimate the probability that their decision was correct. And this confidence estimate in being right in this kind of task, there's a lot of debate in the field about what actually would go into that kind of confidence estimate. I don't want to go into that here, but most of the models have in common that, together with the kind of models that Florent was showing you, that this confidence estimate is a Bayesian estimate of some probability of being correct. And this is not a new idea, so this is a paper all the way back in 1884 by Pearce and Jastrow, and here they were interested in studying subjects' confidence judgments in a discrimination of the heaviness of objects. And interestingly, they proposed, or they realized, that the confidence judgments seemed to conform to this rule, which was proportional to the log odds of the objective probability of being correct. So I think this is one of the first computational modeling papers you can find in psychology, suggesting that this is a rule linking confidence to a probability of being correct. And on the neuroscience side, there's been work trying to understand where this self-monitoring ability may come from. So really there's been focus on two main sets of brain regions. So one focus has been on this area of the medial frontal cortex, the posterior medial frontal cortex, which includes the anterior cingulate. And on the medial surface here, you get a response known as the error-related negativity in the EEG signal shortly after subjects make an error, even if they haven't been told that they've made an error. So this is the idea that these signals here may allow for or support self-monitoring because they occur very early after an erroneous response, even before the feedback has been given to the subject. And another line of work has looked at how differences in the ability to evaluate cognitive processes, so the ability to monitor your performance on a variety of tasks, is linked to variability in the structure and function of the anterior prefrontal cortex. So brain regions right towards the front of the human frontal lobe, where changes, for instance, if you have damage to these regions, then you have impairments in your ability to self-monitor. But I think it's fair to say that we don't really understand the relative role of these brain regions in supporting this computational process, basically allowing us to reflect on our confidence in decision making. And part of the difficulty here is, by definition, these metacognitive evaluations are relatively unconstrained. So basically we put people in a task, we don't give them feedback, but we ask them to reflect on how well they think they're doing. And so it's potentially hard to push around people's metacognition in the same way that we can push around people's response to feedback, because we can control that as experimenters. So recently we've been interested in studying this more intermediate case that we refer to as change of mind, where here we can give people information about their decisions, so we can give people new information about whether they were right or wrong, but this information is not explicit feedback. So you're not explicitly told you were right or wrong on the decision, but it's new information to help you understand whether you were right or wrong. And to give you an intuition for this kind of new information, I'm going to briefly remind you about Brexit. After the UK voted to leave the European Union, we got some post-decision information about whether that was a good or bad idea. And so the first kind of piece of post-decision evidence we got was the pound kind of falling off the cliff, but this was didn't seem to change people's minds very much, because many people were saying, well, this is a short-term effect and eventually we'll reach the land of milk and honey. But then something catastrophic happened. So Marmite got taken off the shelves of Tesco, and because Tesco couldn't buy it at the same price due to the pound falling. And for those of you who don't know, Marmite is this spread you put on toast, and some people love it, some people hate it. In the north of England, most people love it, and so when this got pulled off the shelves, you would have thought by reading the papers that this was a big piece of post-decision evidence that maybe Brexit wasn't such a great decision after all. And so the idea is, how do people integrate these new pieces of evidence that are not explicit? You're not being told, yes, that was a bad decision, or no, it was a good decision. But it's a new piece of evidence about the accuracy or the goodness of an original choice. How do you integrate this new evidence to update your confidence in an original choice? So here we're not going to use decisions about voting to leave the EU. We're going to use something a lot more prosaic, so decisions about the movement of random dots. And this was an experiment that I conducted together with Nathaniel Dorr when I was a postdoc in New York, and master student Illy van der Putten. So the task of the subjects here is to categorize whether a patch of noisy moving dots is going to the left or to the right of the screen, and I'll show you an example of that kind of patch in a minute. And we could alter the strength of that evidence by changing the coherence of the dot patch, such that there were 3 levels of difficulty. So it could either be strong information, so that was an easy decision, or weak information, so that was a decision. And then subjects were asked to categorize that motion as going to the left or to the right. And so far this is a pretty standard perceptual decision-making task. But the twist that we added was we added a new source of evidence after the choice. So here again you get to see a patch of random dot motion. Critically, this was always in the same direction as the pre-decision motion, so it was always helpful to the subjects. And again, it could have been drawn from one of 3 levels of motion strength. And the reason subjects needed to pay attention to this post-decision motion is that at the end of the trial, we asked them how confident they were in their original choice. So we told them this was bonus evidence that they could use to work out how confident they were at the end of the trial. So I'll just give you an intuition for what it's like to be a subject in this task. This is not the exact timeline you saw. I just put it together in Keynote animation, but hopefully you can get a sense of what it would be like to be a subject. So you start off viewing a patch of dots on the screen, moves briefly, and then you're asked, should you decide left or right? And then you get a new patch, again, moves briefly, and you're asked for your confidence. So in this case, as you can see, that was a relatively strong coherence. So you should have said right initially, and then basically that new information confirmed, provided additional evidence that that indeed was a good decision. So a few details that are important. So we adjusted the coherence individually for each subject based on a pre-experiment calibration session. It was a fully factorial design, so this is quite important. So we have 3 levels of coherence before the decision, but that could be fully crossed with 3 levels of coherence after the decision. So that gives us 9 conditions in our factorial design. And we incentivize the confidence rating using what's known as the quadratic scoring rule. And I'll explain exactly what that rule is a bit later on, because it becomes important to dissociate confidence from changes in the expected value of the choice. And every subject in the study carried out 2 sessions on 2 different days. So a first session was a behavioral session where they provided 100 trials per condition, so 900 trials, and then the same subject went into the fMRI scanner on a separate day and carried out 360 trials of the task. So before I show you the data, I just want to explain how we're going to model this. And so we're going to use a variant of signal detection theory where here we're assuming that the subject gets, as I mentioned on in the earlier slide, subject gets a noisy impression of the true state of the world. So here the true state of the world is that the dots are going to the left or to the right. And so the model draws a sample from one of 2 Gaussians where the separation between these Gaussians is controlled by the coherence of the stimulus. So if you get a strong stimulus, it's more discriminable. A weak stimulus, it's less discriminable. And then the subject makes a choice based on that sensory sample. So far this is just standard signal detection theory, but what we added into the model is the notion that the subject gets another sample, which we call ex post, that's drawn from the same direction but with a potentially different coherence level. So there's a single free parameter here mapping the coherence level into signal to noise ratio, so that's K, but the strength of the ex pre and the ex post could differ on each trial. And then the Bayesian model basically sums up the log odds of the evidence in favor of right or left and compares it to the choice that was made, and then that gives you an ideal observer confidence estimate, which is basically the probability you're correct given the sum total of the evidence so far and the choice that you made halfway through the trial. Now, we compared lots of different variants of this model. This is the kind of baseline ideal observer model, and I'll show you a model comparison in a couple of slides, but basically they all have the same qualitative feature that you're comparing the strength of evidence at the end of the trial to the choice that was made. And the kind of key qualitative feature that we're going to be looking for in both the behavioral data and the imaging data as a signature of this integration of post-decision evidence is this interaction pattern. So what I'm plotting here is a simulation from the model where on the y-axis is the confidence or the log odds correct from the model at the end of the trial, and on the x-axis we've got the level of post-decision motion coherence. And this qualitative feature is an interaction between the strength of motion and the accuracy of the original choice. And so intuitively, if the model was originally correct and gets stronger evidence, then its confidence should go up because that's confirming its original choice. Whereas if the model was originally incorrect and it gets stronger evidence, then its confidence should go down because that's disconfirmatory evidence. It goes against the choice that was originally made. So this is the kind of interaction pattern we're going to look for in our behavioral data and our imaging data. Okay, so this is I'm going to show you the behavioral data first. I'm plotting out all 9 conditions of the factorial design. So the fastest moving factor is the strength of pre-decision motion coherence, and the slowest moving factor, these 3 groups of points here, is the strength of the post-decision motion coherence. And the box plots here are the behavioral data, and the solid lines are the fits of the winning computational model. So here on the left, in the left panel, we've got performance or percent correct. So unsurprisingly, as the level of pre-decision motion coherence goes up, then subjects become better at that initial discrimination judgment, and it's logically impossible for there to be an effect of post-decision coherence, but reassuring there's no magic going on. What's more interesting is the confidence data. So here now I've split out the confidence data at the end of the trial according to whether the subject was originally correct in blue or wrong in red. And again, separated for the 9 conditions of the factorial design. And the main feature of the data I wanted to highlight is the fact that we get this interaction pattern that's inherent to the model, where when you get stronger post-decision information, if you're originally right, then your confidence goes up, whereas if you're originally wrong, then your confidence goes down. And this is the data from the same subjects here now in the fMRI scanner. All the same features of the data are reproduced. So I mentioned before we compared a whole bunch of different variants of that original Bayesian model. The best fitting model was that original Bayesian model, but with this additional term which basically modulates the final confidence you have in your choice by the response time of that initial decision. So basically this is consistent with other work in the literature on decision confidence, suggesting that confidence is not just a function of your accuracy or the difficulty of the trial, but also that your response time, if you respond faster, that's a cue to greater confidence. And so basically this model, which modifies the ideal observer log odds with a response time parameter, gives us the best fit to the data. But the important point, as I mentioned before, is that all of these models we compare show this same qualitative interaction between the strength of post-decision evidence and the choice accuracy. So we had some regions of interest, those regions that I mentioned earlier on for our fMRI analysis. So on the one hand, we're interested in this posterior medial frontal region that's been implicated in performance monitoring and error monitoring, and we're also interested in the anterior prefrontal cortex that has been implicated in metacognition. So we specified a priori ROIs for this. So we took one ROI for the posterior medial frontal cortex from our previous study on confidence. For the anterior prefrontal cortex, we capitalized on the fact that there's this nice recent parcellation based on diffusion tensor imaging data from the Rushworth lab in Oxford, and they've identified these 3 sub-regions of the anterior PFC in humans, which is area 46, lateral frontal pole, and medial frontal pole. So the first thing we did was to look across the whole brain for this qualitative interaction between the strength of post-decision evidence and the accuracy of the original choice. And because we were agnostic about the sign in which we would see that, whether it would be coded positively or negatively, we looked for both signs of the interaction effect. And interestingly, when we did that, we saw this very focal and robust cluster of activation in the posterior medial frontal cortex. And this was very close to this ROI that I outlined on the previous slide. And when we extract data from that ROI, we can see what's driving that interaction effect. And so what we see is a negative interaction compared to the sign of the interaction I was showing on earlier slides from the model. So as the evidence strength goes up here, if the subjects were originally wrong, then you see stronger activity, whereas if the subjects were originally right, then you see weaker activity. And you can see that in the time courses here. There's this kind of flip over in the sign of the relationship between post-decision evidence and bold signal as a function of the original choice accuracy. We can also look at the signal in this region in a slightly different way. So here we've extracted out on a trial-by-trial basis the post-decision evidence, or the delta, the change in log odds correct from the computational model fits. And we've regressed that against the trial-by-trial bold signal in this region, and you get a very robust linear relationship, such that the strongest activation is when you have the lowest post-decision evidence, or conversely, the most evidence that you were likely to be wrong. Now, interestingly, we didn't see, when we then go into we didn't see it whole brain, but when we go into the ROIs in the anterior frontal cortex, we don't see this interaction pattern between the evidence strength and the choice accuracy. However, what we do see in these regions is a parametric effect of the subjective confidence subjects give at the end of the trial. And this is consistent with lots of other studies that have shown negative relationships between confidence and the anterior frontal cortex activity on the lateral surface, and positive relationships in the anterior medial surface. And so what we wondered was whether perhaps what's going on here is that there's a coding of post-decision evidence in the posterior medial frontal cortex that is coded in the frame of choice accuracy, and that this is translated or communicated to the anterior frontal cortex that is coding the final confidence in choice in the frame of reference of what is actually going to be communicated to the experimenter. So to test that, we fitted a series of mediation models where we took the post-decision evidence, or the delta, the change in log odds correct from the computational model, and entered that into a mediation analysis onto final confidence. So we know from our behavioral data that there's a significant link here, but what we wanted to know was whether particular brain regions may mediate that link. And so we can do that on an ROI basis. So first of all, we fitted that model to the 3 anterior prefrontal ROI activities. And what we found was that, so here the solid arrows reflect a significant path in this model, and the red arrows going through the bubble reflect the significance of the mediation effect. And what we found is that for the lateral frontal pole and area 46, so slightly further back on the lateral surface, we did find evidence for significant mediation between post-decision evidence and final confidence. When we flip the order of those X and Y variables, then this mediation goes away. So this is a correlational technique. We can't say this is causal in terms of the mediation, the flow of information, but we can say that this direction provides the best account of the data. Interestingly, we didn't see a mediation effect on the medial surface, even though there the activation was correlating with reported confidence. So I'll come on to that in a couple of slides. So another thing we can do is, rather than fit our mediation model on to individual ROIs, we can fit it on a whole brain level. So you basically iterate through the brain and fit this model to every single voxel, and then at the end of your analysis, you then put it all back together and look for significant clusters where the mediation effect is most robust. And what we see corroborating the ROI analysis is a cluster in the left anterior prefrontal cortex that shows a significant mediation between the change in post-decision evidence from the model and the final confidence expressed by the subjects. So I mentioned earlier that we use this quadratic scoring rule to incentivize confidence, and what that rule basically does is reward subjects according to the accuracy of their confidence judgment. So if you report high confidence and you were correct, then you're going to get large reward, whereas if you report low confidence and you were incorrect, you'll also get large reward. So it basically imposes this kind of quadratic shape on the expected value as a function of the total log odds correct. And so intuitively, when you dip below this 0.5 point in your confidence, you're now transitioning from betting in favor that your choice was originally correct to betting against your choice. And we can leverage that feature of the design to then try and dissociate out signals related to the expected value, which shows this U-shape, and the continuous confidence estimate. So on these change of mind trials, there should be a divergence between activity that's coding for confidence and value. And we can do that in a split regression analysis. So here I've basically entered the confidence level in a GLM predicting activity in these regions, but done it separately for no change trials and change trials. And what you can see is that in these lateral frontal areas, you see this consistent negative slope. So it's coding for confidence both in the no change portion of the graph, but also in the change portion of the graph. Interestingly though, the medial frontal region shows this dual effect, and you'll see this more on the next slide, where you do code for confidence in this portion, but then it flips over and also codes for expected value. So this is consistent with previous work from Matthias Pasiglione and Milo Breton here, showing that this medial surface contains both confidence and value signals. Another way of looking at that is in a continuous regression. So here we're entering both value and confidence in a multiple regression analysis to predict activity in these ROIs, and you can see that in this medial region you get significant effects of both confidence and value pretty much around the same time point, whereas by the time you get out to the lateral surface, now you're getting only a confidence effect, and that confidence effect, interestingly, is appearing later in time, although we didn't have the ability to dissociate out the timing of the signals in these regions. Okay, so just to conclude on this study, what I've shown you is that by studying these within trial changes of mind, we potentially can get a stronger experimental control on the computational role of regions that are involved in metacognition. And that the posterior medial frontal cortex shows this signature of post-decision evidence integration in the frame of choice accuracy, whereas the anterior prefrontal cortex seems to care more about the final confidence that subjects express in their choice than the post-decision evidence itself. And I think this is now speculation, but it's not an enormous leap to suggest that dysfunction in these networks may then manifest as impairments in metacognition and can start to explain why, for instance, when you do have lesions to these anterior sectors of the frontal lobe, that you might see people with deficits in metacognition. So in the last few minutes, I want to just highlight a study we've been doing recently in the lab to follow up on these findings and take it in a slightly different direction. And this is a new area for me, but this is something I'm getting more interested in, is trying to connect up to the level of real-world decision-making and policy. And so when we think about changes of mind, then often we're thinking about things like our beliefs about real-world events, and it's I don't need to tell you that over the past few years there's clearly been this kind of polarization in people's beliefs about various issues like climate change and politics and so forth. And so this is interesting to think about, like, how do these low-level kind of change of mind self-monitoring mechanisms that we're studying in the lab, how might they connect up to people's daily evaluations of the accuracy of their beliefs? And there's a couple of, this is obviously a huge topic with a huge literature, and I can't go into everything here, but basically there's a couple of lines of theory on what might drive this kind of belief polarization, or what might drive people to adopt particular positions on that political spectrum. And so on the one hand, there's the notion of motivated reasoning. So people's political orientation is clearly important for one's self-concept, and this may lead to domain-specific information processing. So for instance, if you hear information about climate change, then you might take that information in a way that's biased in order to then sustain a particular affiliation to a political party or way of life. On the other hand, it's been pointed out in the social psychology literature that this might not be the entire story, that there may actually be these domain general characteristics of information processing. So people might just have different cognitive styles, and those different cognitive styles, whether they're more rigid or more flexible, may then lead to differences in the way that they process information, not only about political issues, but also about any information they're getting over the course of their life. And so we wanted to try and think about whether these kind of computational mechanisms that we're thinking about in terms of changes of mind and self-monitoring may be related to these domain general characteristics that are reflective of differences in cognitive style. So the hypothesis we were entertaining here is whether the extremity of belief about political issues would be linked to the metacognitive capacity to revise previously held decisions. And this was work done by my PhD student Max Rollwager in collaboration with Ray Dolan at UCL. So we did this over Amazon Mechanical Turk. This was a cohort of US adult participants. There were two data sets. The first one had 380 subjects, and the second one, which was a replication data set, had 414 subjects. And we asked every subject in the study to do three things. So they first carried out two tasks, and I'll explain those tasks in sequence, and they also filled out a series of questionnaires about political attitudes. And the first task was a perceptual decision-making task, similar to the one that I've just described. Here, rather than using random dot motion, we're using a static dot discrimination task, so they have to decide which of two boxes contains more dots. Again, we can titrate the difficulty of that task for each subject to allow them to perform the task at a similar difficulty level. And then at the end of the trial, so in task 1 there was no post-decision evidence. Here it's just a straight confidence rating in whether their decision was correct. So as I mentioned, the same subjects also filled out a series of 78 questions, which were drawn from standard political attitude surveys, and also questions designed to assess the intransience of belief. So things like, do you think that other people are always wrong and I'm always right? Questions along those lines. And we then conducted a factor analysis on this set of questionnaires, and the two factors I'm going to talk about today are one we labelled political orientation, which does what it says on the tin. It basically identifies your liberal versus conservative orientation, and the other one was one we labelled political radicalism. This tended to load on questions about belief in transience. And so interestingly, as you can see, this political radicalism factor shows a quadratic relationship with the political orientation factor. So people both at the extreme of the left of the spectrum and at the extreme of the right show this greater radicalism or belief in transience. So what we're going to be interested in doing is trying to explain variance in this radicalism factor by features of the data from our task. So what we're doing here is basically a multiple regression analysis where we have various predictors, both demographic variables and also variables related to their first order decision performance, but also variables related to their metacognitive accuracy, which is how they're able to monitor, the subjects are able to monitor their first order performance using this confidence scale. And the two points, the two data points are basically the two data sets, right? So the left-hand point is the original data set, the right-hand point is this replication set. And for the demographic variables and variables due to the perceptual performance, so this is the choice accuracy, but we can also look at the evidence strength. Anything related to perceptual performance basically showed no significant effect. And for the demographic variables, we got relatively weak and inconsistent effects. However, on this first task, interestingly, we saw that for when we computed metacognitive sensitivity, so this is a parameter that tracks how accurate the confidence ratings were on a trial-by-trial basis, we saw a significant negative association with radicalism in both data sets. So people who are more extreme on the spectrum, there's no differences in their first-order performance. They're equally good at performing the random dot discrimination task, but they're worse at monitoring whether they got the answer right or wrong. And we can explore why this is the case. So here I've basically, I'm plotting out splitting the data according to the 20% most radical subjects, and then the rest of the data which we label moderates. And here is the cumulative probability distribution of the confidence separated according to whether the trial was correct in green and incorrect in red. And so what you can see is that there's this difference in the highest confidence ratings given following incorrect responses. So moderates almost never use the 100% rating when they were incorrect, whereas the radicals are still sometimes using that 100% rating. And so that basically leads to a squashing of these distributions together and a lowered metacognitive sensitivity. So this is another way of showing that. That's the difference curve for the error trials. There's basically no difference following correct trials, so the confidence estimates are not substantially different across the board, but it's selective for these error trials. So I'm running out of time a little bit, so I'll just show you the data from the second task. Here we're using the post-decision evidence manipulation I mentioned earlier, but now with just 2 levels of post-decision evidence strength. Again, we're going to look for that interaction pattern with choice accuracy, and what we see is that, so this is low post-decision evidence strength and high post-decision evidence strength. What we see is that for the radicals, again, there's no difference in the correct trials, but for the incorrect trials, this initial difference in confidence from task 1 is just exacerbated in the face of post-decision evidence. So the radicals just become less able to update their confidence following these incorrect decisions. And we can see that in the regression analysis. Here we've entered the slope of on the correct trials, that's what we call confirmatory evidence integration, and the slope on the incorrect trials, that's what we're calling disconfirmatory evidence integration. And we see this selective effect in both data sets on disconfirmatory evidence integration. Okay, so just to conclude, so I showed you in the earlier data set that we see these brain regions in the posterior medial frontal cortex and the lateral APFC as playing complementary roles in computational subserving changes of mind. And in the second data set, I've shown you that the extremity of political beliefs is correlated with alterations in metacognition, but not performance in this low-level perceptual discrimination task. And interestingly, we've been speculating about whether this might provide some framework for understanding pretty robust but potentially puzzling findings in political neuroscience. So there's been this robust association between changes in the function and structure of this posterior medial frontal region, and that's been linked to changes in political orientation. So one, it's often been interpreted in terms of the change of subjective conflict that liberals feel, right? But it could be actually due to the fact that this region is involved in revising and updating our beliefs, and this might provide a computational framework in which to understand that. And so in general, I'd like to suggest that alterations in these core computations supporting changes of mind may contribute to the consolidation of extreme beliefs. And this is helpful in our task, but I think it's important to point out that it's not helpful if the information should be distrusted, right? So if I was actually giving you, trying to play tricks on you or giving you information that may not be helpful in revising your choice, then actually it would be more adaptive to be like the radicals and not integrate that new information after making a so-called error. So that's it. I just want to thank members of my lab, particularly Max Rollwager, who did the work in the second experiment, and collaborators Nathaniel Dorr and Ray Dolan, who I've worked with for many years on this line of work. And thank you very much for your attention.
Hi. Great talk. Do you think it's plausible that something like radicalism or the metacognitive effects from second could be mediated by something simple like stress or inflammation or something like that? Is there any evidence for that you know in the literature?
So we didn't. One of the drawbacks of doing these studies over Mechanical Turk is that you have a limited access to the subject, so you can't really know what exactly their state of mind is, or you have a limited time with them in the sense you can't expect them to fill out an enormous set of questionnaires. So we don't really know, is the answer in this study, what their stress levels were. There is some evidence that stress induced in the lab leads to a drop in metacognition, and that would make sense given the effects we know of stress on the prefrontal cortex, for instance. And so that story could go together, but in this study we don't have access to those variables, so we can't really say.
Thanks a lot, Steve, for the data and for sharing this. I was curious what kind of computations could explain, for instance, the effect you have in radicals that they don't seem to change their minds following errors. Is it that, can you see, even if you model their data, whether it is more that they have a stronger confirmatory bias, or whether that they downweight this confirmatory evidence, so that they have a lower gain on the disconfirmatory evidence?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we're working on that at the moment. So the set of models that the models that I showed you in this study from New York, here. So we have these models that we fitted to the data we collected in the lab. Now this is only 22 subjects, and we didn't collect measures of political orientation. But what we do have is, exactly as you described, models that can accommodate differences in the weighting of evidence following the choice, but also differences in just a bias. So you wouldn't change your sensitivities in your evidence, but maybe you are more likely to stick to the choice that you originally made. And in this data set, interestingly, we didn't need to add those terms to accommodate the features of the data in the lab. These were well-trained subjects, and probably, because they're all university students, probably on a similar end of the political spectrum. But Max is working on exactly this, fitting this suite of models to the data from the political data set. And certainly we're, in order to accommodate the difference between the radicals and the moderates, the ideal observer won't do it, right? So you do need to add in some kind of weighting or bias term, and we're just trying to work out which one we need to add.
So I'm just curious, was there any effect of the absolute political orientation, the first part?
Oh, you mean, okay, so splitting it with right and left, or, yeah, so we tried that. We don't really have much power when you start dividing the data set in half. The effects are qualitatively similar for both right and left. So we haven't found anything in those decision data that can pull apart those two ends of the spectrum.
Okay.
Yeah.
So between two perceptual decision-making tasks, there is actually mixed evidence that it would be something general like metacognitive sensibility. In your case, you generalize from perceptual to political beliefs. My question is, how strongly do you believe that you have a common system for computing confidence in the brain?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think for perceptual decision making, the evidence seems to support it doesn't really matter what sensory modality you're dealing with. There seems to be relatively common activations, and from your study as well, the PNAS paper, there seems to be relatively common activations for the visual and the auditory. And I think that there is some evidence that metacognition on external information, perceptual information, seems to differ from metacognition about your memory. So when that information has to be retrieved, there seems to be different systems involved. So we found dissociations, neuropsychological dissociations between metacognition for memory and perception. How that then relates to the kind of decision making that you're doing in the real world and taking in information from the news and this kind of thing, I think that is difficult to know. I would view that as being closer to the perceptual decision making because you're being fed information rather than having to retrieve from memory. But that's a very coarse distinction. I think there's lots to be done on the domain generality side of things. Yeah.
I go for the last.
Okay.
So maybe maybe it sounds like a technical question, but in your segmentation theory model, I wonder if you what type of knowledge that the ideal observer would have in terms of the difficulty of the task and the possibility that the coherence would change between the pre and post evidence, and whether that would assume like maybe the other observer would assume something else.
Yeah, so in this model here, I glossed over that a little bit, but here this is the generative model in terms of the samples that the subject is getting, so we can change the strength of the separation between these Gaussians, so that's the D prime of the model. But when we're computing confidence down here, in this model, we assume that subjects don't know the coherence level, so that they have they marginalize over possible coherences. So you can assume different things there. You could assume that they would know the coherence, in which case the inference is subtly different than if you assume they don't know the coherence. In all these model fits, I assume that they didn't know the coherence, but actually the fits don't really change if you manipulate that. Basically, the model just becomes a little more confident if it assumes that it does know the coherence.
Do you think people would know in your past?
I don't know actually. I think
do you think they would realize the change in coherence from the pre to the post, for instance? I
mean, just subjectively doing this kind of task, if you've got 3 levels of motion coherence that you're titrating to a range between, say, 60% and 80% correct, I find it very hard to know what condition I'm in. I mean, we haven't formally tested that, like whether people could discriminate on coherence rather than direction. But subjectively, I feel like I have no idea which condition I'm in.